Hey buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis is the name and Hearthstone is the game, and these are my 10 best cards of 2017. That's right, the year has finally come to a close, and I wanted to lay out the cards I thought had the biggest impact on the year. Now, these aren't necessarily the highest power level cards of the year, but these are the cards which in 2017 we saw the most, showed up in the most meta decks, seemed to have the biggest influence on standard format constructed Hearthstone play. So that said, this is not an arena list, this is not a wild list, and this is all based on my own personal opinion. I didn't turn to any data here. These, to me, were the cards which were the very, very top of the list, the best of the best for the entire year. And I should also note that these were not cards which were released in 2017, but any cards which were played in standard format throughout the course of the year. Here's my list of the top 10. At the number 10 spot, we have Journey to Ungro's Firefly. Now, this certainly doesn't seem like the kind of card that should make a best of list because it's just a meager little one-drop. It's a tiny 1/2 in stats. It's kind of one of those cards that doesn't seem like it's all that important, but Firefly has been in so many decks. Aggressive decks have run it, control decks have run it. Basically, since its release, it's just been everywhere. It can slot into almost anything. It's just a great multiple-bodied card, which allows you to apply pressure in a faster deck. It allows you to slow down your opponents if you're trying to kill a bunch of 1/1s that your opponent has played in the patches style meta. Firefly just seemed to meet those needs, and it didn't really matter that it was an elemental necessarily. That's not been the reason this one stood out. It's just a nice little value one-drop that is so flexible and fits across so many different archetypes that this guy has been absolutely everywhere since the day he showed up. Moving on to the number 9 spot, we actually have another flexible Journey to Ungro card. This time around, it's Tar Creeper. And I think most notably, this one looks like an anti-aggro style card, and a lot of control decks throughout the course of the year were running Tar Creeper, but even aggro decks have been able to run this one too, because as it turns out, just getting a lot of stats on the board for 3 mana and shutting out your opponent, denying them value trades into your stronger, more threatening board can serve really well in aggro decks too. So this is another card that's just been run across so many different decks. I felt like I had to include it on this list. It's been a big part of the meta throughout the course of most of the years, basically the final 3/4 of the year since Journey to Ungro was released. So Tar Creeper, another humble looking card, but one that has had a big and lasting impact on Hearthstone. Moving on to my number 8 spot, it really shouldn't be too surprising to see this one on the list if you're playing Hearthstone these days. You know that Corridor Creeper is everywhere. It's in so many decks. And frankly, if Kobolds and Catacombs had come out earlier in the year and Corridor Creeper had more time in the meta, this card would have been even higher on the list. The only reason it's this low is because it's only been out in the last 3 or 4 weeks of the entire year. So it just barely made the cut, but it's made such a big, just giant impact since it was released in those few short weeks that I felt like it still deserved mentioning, because few cards have ever been as popular as Corridor Creeper is right now, and few cards have ever made as much of an impact, so I thought it deserved some recognition despite only being in 2017 for such a short while. Corridor Creeper has already left his mark on the meta. Moving on to the number 7 spot here, we have Leeroy Jenkins. And Leeroy has basically always been one of the best cards of every year in Hearthstone, simply because Leeroy is still today the go-to finisher style card for so many different aggro decks. And as is always the case, aggro was a big part of 2017 as well. Lots of decks have just dropped this one in at the top of their curve to give them that final blow potential. So it shouldn't be too surprising to see Leeroy here. He's been used in combo decks, just full-on face decks, and a little bit of everything in between. Leeroy has found a lot of different spots in the meta in the course of the last year, so a very fitting card for this list. Up next at the number 6 spot here, we have Shadowreaper Anduin from Priest, and this one I think could arguably be even higher on the list, because very few cards have been as dominant in Hearthstone as Shadowreaper Anduin has in the second half of the year here in 2017. But since this is only a class card and it's only being run in one class, I didn't feel like I could put it higher than some of the neutral cards in this list, which have been played across multiple classes and therefore more archetypes, and have just had a wider area of influence across the entire course of the year. But of course, Highlander Priest is everywhere still to this day, up to the very last day of the year, and it was pretty quickly identified in Knights of the Frozen Throne. So for essentially almost the last half of the year, Anduin has just completely shifted the meta in his direction. You have to be able to beat Anduin decks fast enough before they get to Raza Anduin, or have some way to outlast them, both of which can be pretty difficult. So the meta has shifted itself and shaped itself around the single card, and until Raza rotates out, it looks like Anduin's going to continue into 2018 for at least a few months. So you can't underestimate just how valuable this card is in the meta and just how big of a change it's made, and that's why it's so high on this list, despite being a card from a single class. And as we move into the top 5, there won't be any more class cards on this list, but up first here, we have Prince Keleseth, a card I never really expected to make such an impact when I first saw it, but after some of the nerfs to Druid right out of the Knights of the Frozen Throne meta, Prince Keleseth and the rest of that sort of tempo package with Cobalt Scalebane and South Seas and Patches and all these other cards just completely took over Hearthstone. Basically every class, even Highlander Priest, started running Keleseth and that package. And when an entire expansion's meta essentially builds itself around a single card, I think you have to recognize just how important that card has been to the year. So even though Prince Keleseth is another card that only showed up in the last half of the year, still changed things so much, shifted everything all around him, and basically made Hearthstone a Prince Keleseth game for a little while, this card definitely deserves a top 5 spot. And if you're going to talk about Prince Keleseth, I think you have to talk about one of his tempo buddies here. It's Bonemare. And they kind of go together, right? Bonemare and Prince Keleseth are often run in the same kinds of decks, those tempo mid-range sorts of decks I talked about. But the reason I gave Bonemare the nod over Prince Keleseth is because Bonemare was even more quickly identified than Prince Keleseth as a standout card in Knights of the Frozen Throne, and it seemed to make just as big of an impact. A lot of decks could get by running Bonemares without running Keleseth, and if you looked at the stats, during that period, Bonemare was actually played considerably more than Prince Keleseth. So I think this card did ultimately have a bigger impact than Keleseth. It was just more popular and frankly often felt as bad or worse to lose to. So Bonemare for me takes the spot over Prince Keleseth. As much as it was a Prince Keleseth meta, it's really been a Bonemare meta too. And even though this card has lost just a little bit of momentum in the Corridor Creeper era of today, Bonemare is still strong, still influential, and still the kind of card that completely reshaped the year. So a very fitting inclusion on this list. And now as we move into my top 3, we essentially have the Mean Streets of Gadget Zan trio. You'll probably very quickly be able to identify the 3 cards left on this list if you've been playing Hearthstone throughout the course of 2017. And the reason Kazakus and the next 2 cards on this list are at the top of the list is because, of course, they've had the entire year to influence Hearthstone, because Mean Streets of Gadget Zan came out in December of 2016, so these cards have made a giant mark on Hearthstone the entire course of the year, and frankly, they've all been probably the most influential cards anyway. Even if they only had a few months, they've still been so popular. But up first here, we have Kazakus, of course, the sort of pseudo-Reno replacement when he first arrived, but that style of deck has been dominant in Hearthstone ever since. There was only a very brief period, essentially, in the Journey to Ungoro meta where it felt like Kazakus wasn't a huge part of the meta, but pre-Journey to Ungoro, the first 3 months of the year, which are somewhat easy to forget because they were in the previous standard format rotation, Reno Lock was one of the most prominent decks that still had Reno, and it still runs Kazakus. So Kazakus was influencing from January 1st up to Ungoro. Lost a little bit of steam in Ungoro. I felt like there were still, of course, some decks out there utilizing him, but then made a huge comeback with Knights of the Frozen Throne and Shadowreaper Anduin in particular, because, of course, Kazakus is another anchor card in the Highlander Priest archetype, which, of course, has dominated ever since Anduin arrived. So basically, for a vast majority of the year, Kazakus has been a very common and powerful turn for play, and in fact has helped define one of the most prominent archetypes in the entire game, and that's why Kazakus is in the top 3. So now moving on to my number 2 spot, we have Aya Blackpaw, the second of the Gadget Zan trio here at the top of the list. And although it doesn't feel like we're seeing Aya Blackpaw very much today, and a lot of people might be like, wow, you're right, I haven't seen that many Aya Blackpaws played against me, you shouldn't underestimate just how big she's been throughout the course of the year, because of course Jade Druid has been one of the most prominent of all decks in 2017 from the very beginning up until basically the Kobolds and Catacombs era, or at least until some of the nerfs to Druid hit in the Knights of the Frozen Throne meta. Aya Blackpaw was just, of course, the defining card for Jade Druid. You could almost put something like Jade Idol in this spot as well, just because Jades were so big and so crazy strong, particularly right as Knights of the Frozen Throne and Ultimate Infestation and Spreading Plague hit. Jade just felt unbelievably good. But of course, Jade Idol is only available to Druid, and Aya Blackpaw has actually made some pretty big influences in Shaman as well. So since she has that tri-class identity, she has made a wider mark than would something like Jade Idol, because don't forget, right early at the beginning of the year, Aggro Shaman was actually a really powerful deck with some of the Pirate package and Small Time Buccaneer, and Aya Blackpaw and the Jade set for Shaman also dropped into there. And of course, Aya Blackpaw has also been a big part of Token Evolve Shaman throughout a majority of the year, which is a very strong tier 1 or tier 2 deck as well. So Aya Blackpaw has basically always enabled a couple strong Jade-style decks to be important in 2017, and it's just one of those cards that's very much summarized the year. It's just like Aya was everywhere for so long that it feels like Aya deserves an even higher spot than Kazakus in my mind, just because Jade was the card of 2017, or the archetype, or the annoyance, or the most hated thing in 2017 in a lot of ways. So that's why Aya Blackpaw, to me, takes the number 2 spot. And then finally, of course, there's one last card, and I really don't even have much to say about this one. It is Patches the Pirate, and if 2017 was anything, it was the year of the Pirate. Of course, right off the bat in 2017, we were still reeling in these small-time Buccaneer, aggro, pirate-style decks with Pirate Rogue and Pirate Shaman and Pirate Warrior in particular, just completely dominating everybody with the raw aggression of Patches and Small Time Buccaneer. But even after the nerfs to Small Time Buccaneer, Patches has still stuck around as just the most consistent, most dominant, most powerful card of all. He's in so many different decks. He has single-handedly made South Sea Deckhand, and South Sea Captain good cards by himself, and that little pirate package has showed up in so many different decks. Even, like I said before, Priest is running things like Patches. You know that's a sign that this card is just so darn good. Everybody hates him. He's in charge now, and he is undoubtedly, without argument, there is no question in my mind at all that Patches the Pirate deserves the number 1 spot on this list. He is the number 1 card of 2017. And there you go, folks. That's my personal list for the 10 best cards in 2017. I'm sure there's a lot of debate out there to be had about the order for these cards, or some cards I left off the list. I'd love to hear all of that, because this is just my take, right? This is the cards that, to me, had the biggest impact and made the most influence on Hearthstone. But that's a little different in everybody's perspective. Of course, I try to keep a pretty broad view of the game and see it in its widest scopes and catch everything there is to see. So I think this is a good estimation of the reality of things, but your opinion could be very different, and that doesn't make it any less valid. So share your take. What were your 10 top cards? Do you think Tar Creeper and Firefly actually belonged on the list? Those were 2 spots I had trouble filling in. I know it's the sort of non-legendary, non-super influential cards, but ones that still seem to see a lot of play. I'm curious what you'd put in those spots, or how you'd rearrange this list, where you'd put Patches, Aya, and Kazakus in particular. All of that I want to hear, so leave your take in the comments below. But until then, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, game on.